Well, welcome to this event focusing on fragile finances. I'm your moderator, Mark Edo. This is part of the UNDP's series on development dialogues that focuses on crisis and fragility from a people-centered perspective. It's in partnership with OECD and the United States Institute for Peace, or USIP. It's a 90-minute interactive session with just one panel discussion. We'll have an opening and a closing statements and plenty of time for questions to be answered by panelists. Now, I strongly encourage you to log into YouTube and type in your questions or your opinions on the topics for today in the comments section. I'll take them off YouTube and fire them at our speakers. Remember, you must include your name, your title, and your location. And if you can, tell us who your question is directed to. I'll endeavor to pose as many questions as we have time for. This is the fourth development dialogue I've moderated this year, and I think they've saved the best for last. The topic is fragile finance, managing risks and supporting stability. Some would say it's the most pressing issue for nations staring down the specter of the world's worst global pandemic in 100 years, while dealing with the harsh realities of conflict or crisis. Rich nations have dug deep, and they've spent huge amounts on bolstering their economies and insulating themselves against COVID-19 effect. About 7% of GDP compared to, say, African economies that averaged only 3%. It's not nearly enough to stop 30 million people sliding into extreme poverty. Then there's debt. Even before the pandemic hit, fragile economies were seeing the fastest and largest increase in debt in 50 years. Let's look again at Africa, where many countries are in a fragile context. With the onset of COVID, public debt as a percentage of GDP in African countries rose last year by a whopping average of 75%. It's rising even further this year. Alarmingly, African governments are now allocating an average of 30% of their revenue to service that ballooning debt. No wonder there's plenty of hand-wringing and furrowed brows around the cresting debt wave. Solving this conundrum seems to be getting more complex by the day. All this comes at a time when economies need to ramp up, not slow down, spending on healthcare and other public goods to cushion the impact of the pandemic and get themselves back on their feet. Plus, donor countries are dealing with their own COVID realities, and they're facing fiscal pressures that are going to undoubtedly impact their decision-making on how much and how far they want to help. All this presents a clear and present danger, not just to people, not just to communities, but to the sustainable development goals and to peace and to security. So, how do we work together to identify pathways to progress? We've assembled some great thinkers to discuss these issues around fragile finances, managing risks, supporting stability. But before we dive in, I'd like to show you the shortest of short films about these UNDP development dialogues. UNDP wants to use this platform to rethink and re-emphasize, rethink our approach to combating crisis and fragility, and re-emphasize a more people-centered approach to development with bold new approaches for the decade of action. We want to strengthen the international community's global commitment to leave no one behind. After all, global development is in everyone's interest. If you could please roll the film now. I should tell you that the UNDP Development Dialogues continues for another 2 months, so make sure you catch some of the other sessions that are coming up in the next 2 months. So let's get started. Jorge Moreira da Silva heads the OECD's Development Cooperation Directorate. His team promotes coordinated international action towards SDGs in developing countries, and it helps them by improving their finances. Now, before OECD, he was Portugal's Minister of Environment and Energy. I should also mention that Mr. da Silva was once one of us. Years ago, he worked as the program manager on climate change innovative finance at UNDP's Bureau for Development Policy. I welcome Jorge Moreira da Silva to give us the opening statement. Jorge.
Thank you very much, Mark, and it's great to be with such a distinguished group of colleagues today. It's the first of many conversations on this important topic. We are here to understand better the links between financing and fragility. This was an important topic even before COVID-19, but it is even more pressing now. Massive financing packages are being negotiated in OECD countries. Decisions today about public and private support for the COVID response and recovery and development and humanitarian finance will impact the future trajectory of global fragility. There is added urgency because fragility is on the rise in many places. For example, the political tensions and violence in Somalia, Chad, or in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Even before the pandemic, we saw the risk of violent conflict increasing over the past decade. The majority of those conflicts happen countries that are on the OECD fragility framework. In 2019, 76% of active violent conflicts globally happened in fragile contexts compared to 61% in 2010. Before the pandemic, financing for fragile contexts showed a mixed scorecard. Some fragile contexts improved their microeconomic frameworks, increased their economic, trade, and financing links, and started to make progress on their tax revenue goals. At the same time, debt burdens, as you just mentioned at the opening remarks, increased sharply in many countries, and private investment remained extremely low. We know that fiscal limitations have constrained many countries' responses to COVID-19, and the pandemic has eroded tax revenue for indirect investment and trade opportunities further. The importance of ODA, official development assistance, in fragile contexts is just one reason that continuing to increase ODA, using it for the highest impact possible, and doing our best to support other sources of financing is so important, especially in 2021, the year the world seeks to put COVID in the past. ODA is the most stable external finance flow for all developing countries, and in extremely fragile contexts, ODA amounts to 10 times the level of foreign direct investment and 2.3 times the amount of remittances. Recently released statistics from the OECD show that ODA increased in 2020 to reach its highest level ever at $161 billion. And the most recent figures for fragile contexts in 2019 show increased net bilateral ODA to fragile contexts, but it remains a small percentage of available global finance. Globally, countries have allocated approximately $16 trillion for recovery spending. COVID-19 has exacerbated all the dimensions of fragility, increasing risks and reducing coping capacities in those places least able to withstand and strain. In this context, the ways in which financing and economic challenges can be linked to fragility and conflict have been put into sharp relief. Let me give you a few examples. On the economic dimension, 2 out of every 5 people that are expected to fall into extreme poverty by 2021 due to COVID-19 are living in fragile contexts. That means 26 million people will live battling extreme poverty and fragility, given that the increased rate of people falling to poverty into extreme poverty in fragile context is twice that of the non-fragile context. This situation is likely to become even more dire, as we stated in our States of Fragility in 2020. Second example on the societal dimension. Women and children feel these effects disproportionately. School closures left 385 million children out of school, many of whom are unlikely to return, while the extreme poverty rate for women is expected to increase 9.4% following the pandemic. Last example, in the environmental dimension. Food insecurity is rising. For example, 1 in 5 children under 5 in the southern parts of Yemen are acutely malnourished, the highest level ever recorded, reflecting a combination of violent conflict, economic decline, funding shortfalls, and COVID-19 impact on the country and its people. On the security and political dimensions, according to forecasts, an additional 13 countries are likely to see new conflicts over the next 2 years, an increase of 56% compared to the pre-pandemic forecast. Debt sustainability and fiscal management are topics we will hear a lot about today. Building resilience is significantly associated with the development of fiscal institutions, and there is evidence to suggest that counter-cyclical fiscal policies in response to COVID shocks can lower the risk of armed conflicts. Dealing effectively with debt can be game-changing. Based on analysis of the data released under the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the OECD estimated that without mitigating measures, debt service among fragile contexts would amount to around $37 billion in 2021. In reality, today, and I'm almost concluding, today's discussion extends beyond the COVID response. It is really about a broader shift in the way of thinking and acting, so that urgent does not mean humanitarian response, and fragility does not only mean crisis response. Support should also be designed to invest in the future. With this maxim in mind, I hope that it guides this session by identifying things we can do now to reduce fragility and conflict in the long term, and a partnership to take those actions forward. So I thank you, Mark, for this opportunity.
It's more than the now, it's also the next. Thank you very much, Jorge Moreira da Silva of OECD, for kicking us off there. Very succinct, short intervention there that brought up a lot of topics we're going to be talking about over the next hour and a half or so. Now we'll move on to the panel. Our panel, of course, is on the subject, fragile finances, managing risk, supporting stability. And this panel should last about an hour. And again, I implore you to fire your questions at me so I can pose them to our panelists, some great panelists. The first is Frank Bousquet. Frank Bousquet. He spent 16 years at the World Bank as a senior director of Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group. And then last month, he took on a new challenge. He moved to the IMF, where he's now the deputy director for the Institute for Capacity Development. Frank leads the IMF's efforts to strengthen its engagement with fragile and conflict-affected states. And one of his main tasks is the implementation of the IMF's $25 billion IDA financing package for poorer countries. And the COVID crisis has had a massive impact on fragile and conflict-affected situations, or FCS, and helping them is one of the greatest challenges facing the international community today. Not only do these countries have enormous needs, but persistent domestic instability has dangerous implications for regional and global stability. It's now more urgent than ever to figure out how to strengthen development financing and manage debt in fragile contexts. Frank, you're very welcome. This looming debt crisis, it's on everyone's minds. Can you demystify a little bit the link between macro fiscal policies, debt sustainability, and fragility? What can, or maybe what should, be done now to help countries who need support? Frank.
Thank you, Mark. Very happy to be here. I have some 2-3 slides which I think will help the audience looking at this link so important between macro fiscal policy and fragility. First, thank you. Very happy to be here. Many thanks to UNDP, OECD, UCIP, key partners on this agenda. And as Jorge mentioned, this topic was already important before the crisis. This is not new. Now, today, it's even more important. So let's maybe have the slides, as you can see. I will try to structure my presentation on 4 parts. First, providing an update on the economic impact of COVID-19 with a focus on those countries that we call FCS, countries that are impacted by fragility and conflict. Second, I would like also to come back to some of the unique challenges that those countries are facing, because I think it's very important to look at those constraints and what does that mean in terms of support. Third, focusing, of course, on the debt issue, so important, like you rightly mentioned, Mark. And then I would just provide a summary, not only of what has been done by the fund, supporting those countries addressing the crisis, but also some key takeaway maybe for the discussion. I will try to be brief. Next slide, please. No, just before. Yep. Yeah. So, impact COVID-19. Clearly, we all know countries across the globe have been suffering significantly major economic setback in 2020. Now, there was actually considerable variation in real GDP growth outcomes across country groups last year. And of course, FCS, those countries impacted by fragility and conflict, have suffered major economic setback from lockdown, from containment measures, from commodity price shocks, but also impact on remittances. Let's not forget that remittances for fragile states represents a major source of revenue, leading to severe contraction in terms of GDP growth last year. Now, already those countries had limited capacity to significantly increase domestic revenue mobilization, to really obtain financing, we know it, but also to boost private investment, which is so critical, mainly due to business environment. So at the end of the day, we are looking, and you can see there's one graph quite important, there is a sizable risk that fragile states will suffer long-lasting effect from the pandemic. Impact is expected to be long-term, with cumulative output per capita projected to rise by less than 0.5% through 2024. So clearly, lack of fiscal space and concessional financing severely constrain the ability to soften the impact of those shocks. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at 2 aspects, quite important. The first one on the financing needs. Very important to recognize that medium-term external financing needs are large and are rising. If you look at those fragile states, low-income countries, the gross external financing needs is going to be increasing from 22 billion to 28 billion over the next 4 or 5 years. And clearly on the debt front, as you can see, over the past 5 years, the share of fragile states, low-income countries with rising debt burden rose from 40 to 63%. Debt levels were, of course, elevated before COVID-19 crisis, and they increased across all the countries. And I will come back to this debt issue, obviously, because it's extremely important in this context. But one of the key messages is obviously that those countries need grants, ODA, and long-term concessional financing. Next slide, please. Now, one slide that actually I think is quite important, because it's a question of this linkage that you mentioned, and that is the topic of this conference about financing and fragility. We saw that fragile states require significant increased financial support, grant, concessional financing. It's also very important to recognize that those countries face unique challenge due to low capacity, due to actually the fragile environment, political economy, dynamics and stability, but also because of governance challenge. And all these means that tailored approach to policy advice and program design is essential. Some key points that are quite important. Building fiscal institution takes time, requires multi-year commitment, and it's not overnight. So remaining engaged, supporting these countries over the long term is essential. Second point, very important to look at gradually supporting reforms, gradual pace for fiscal adjustment to really take into account the institutional capacity constraints that I mentioned, but also sometimes the costs that are needed for cohesion building initiative during these pivotal times, as Professor Collier would say. Third point, very important, macroeconomic policy in this context needs to support inclusive growth, tackling the key drivers of fragility, protecting social spending, social safety nets, programs that are so important. And then the last point, it's also very important to recognize that, yes, we know it, domestic revenue mobilization, tax revenue is the only way to achieve sustainable government financing over the long term. But in those contexts, fragile contexts, it's very difficult to do it in a very short term. So all that means what? Means that we have a number of examples, including from the fund, in terms of supporting those countries in those very difficult times where they have limited capacity that have been tailored. And here I could mention what has been done, and I could come back maybe during discussion in Afghanistan or Somalia, in Sudan, in full partnership with other key stakeholders, whether it's about the World Bank or many other bilateral actors. Next slide, please. So here, very important to look at this debt that was debt vulnerability, which is really essential, like you rightly pointed out, Mark. I would like here to say that following the COVID-19 shock, there has been two important G20 initiatives to support debt relief for low-income and fragile countries. First, the G20 DSSI, Debt Service Suspension Initiative for liquidity relief. Here, this allows eligible countries to defer official debt service to mitigate the pandemic's social, health, and economic impact. And this has already actually enabled 45 of the poorest countries to defer official debt service, freeing up resources that go where? Well, that are being used to mitigate social, economic, health impact of this pandemic. And the initiative delivered about $5.7 billion in debt relief last year, and it has been extended now until end of 2021. Second point, there's also been efforts to help countries who need deeper relief beyond these temporary liquidity supports with the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatments. So very important, this framework for debt treatments beyond the DSSI coordinates Paris and non-Paris club creditor to achieve sovereign debt resolution for DSSI countries that need it. And it was, for instance, recently requested by some countries like Chad, Ethiopia, Zambia. Third point, and it was mentioned, I believe, by Jorge, debt transparency. Promoting debt transparency is very important, recognizing here the role of the IMF in full partnership with the bank in terms of capacity development for debt monitoring to provide at the end a full picture of the debt vulnerability so that both debtors and creditors can make informed decisions to ensure that debt is sustainable. Next slide, and I will be the last one. Very important on a fund side front, there has been major support. Fragile states have benefited extensively from the IMF lending since the start of the COVID-19, with 26 fragile countries that have received emergency financing or disbursement totaling $5.9 billion. 21 of those countries impacted by fragility or conflict have also benefited from debt service relief under the CCRT, which is a Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust, which is for about $500 million to date. And this support has been, again, very important to help countries meet balance of payment needs created by this pandemic, so able to provide some critical health, social, economic support to their population. And I would say that, in addition to financing, like I said before, mentioning the important role of the capacity development that has been provided by many actors, including by the IMF. Capacity development, strengthening institution is a centerpiece of the fund engagement in those countries, with program design and policy advice closely linked to the institutional capacity and supported by capacity development. So let me stop here with the presentation. If I may mark just 3-4 key takeaways that I think are important for the discussion. First, rising debt burden are a major constraint for those countries. So sustained commitment, increased financing, meaning concessional grants are really needed. Second, and this is why also it's important to be gathering this panel across the humanitarian development peace nexus, tailoring fiscal policy in those contexts is primordial, considering the capacity constraints that those countries have, but also the need to incorporate key existing drivers of fragility in the support provided. What does that mean? It means supporting inclusive growth, protecting social spending, and human capital. Education, health is a priority. Third, IMF has scaled up significantly its engagement, as you may have seen from the last slide, for those most vulnerable countries, providing significant emergency financing, increasing its access limit. And the last point, maybe, and I will finish here, is the importance of recognizing that policy actions to tackle high indebtedness, strengthening domestic revenue mobilization, improving governance are essential, supporting really long-term efforts to achieve the SDG, being the ultimate objective. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Frank Bousquet from IMF, the Deputy Director. Remember, if you have questions, now's the time to send the questions for Frank and any other panels, because we'll have some time at the end to pose some questions to Frank. Now, a few days ago, the UNDP's chief economist tweeted that he was, quote, very happy to join my colleagues from OECD, IMF, USIP, and BMZ to talk about fragile finances. Well, here he is, George Gray Molina, UNDP chief economist. George, you're very welcome. Now, this new reality means, I guess, new thinking, maybe new economic models, new architecture. Can you, sir, in 7 minutes, give us your perspective on managing transition in a fragile context? George.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm delighted to be here. Happy to join my colleagues. I can do it in 5 minutes, Mark. So I'll
Perfect.
start it with the help of my colleagues. I just wanted to start by saying that fragile context countries are a test case for the multilateral system. As we've all seen, these countries are undergoing historic COVID reversals and facing enormous debt and fiscal space constraints. So we have two questions. One is the international debt architecture fit for this challenge? And if not, what needs to be done? And I think that's something that I want to discuss in this brief presentation. If my colleague could please put, yes, the PowerPoint. I'll focus on two ideas. One is the COVID response itself and the UN's role in that. And then I'll move into the debt vulnerability discussion, which I think is the core of what we're discussing here today. So if we can move to the next slide, please. The UN system has been working with 139 countries over the past year on what we call a socioeconomic response framework that has 5 pillars, and it's focused on health, on social protection, on economic livelihoods, on macro fiscal policy space, but also on resilience, community resilience, and local resilience. And as we see the rollout of this agenda around the world, we've seen distinct responses in different parts of the world. Over to the next slide, please. The UN system has repurposed close to $3 billion of its own programming and added $2 billion to that amount and focused on these 139 countries. We've been having socioeconomic assessments that dig deep diver into poverty, into malnutrition, into schooling, into gender-based violence, into community resilience, but also focusing on the fiscal and on the debt side. Over to the next one, please. Something that comes out clearly from the socioeconomic assessments and also the socioeconomic response plans on the ground is that these are multidimensional challenges faced in every country around the world, but it's specifically in fragile context countries. So we see an overlapping agenda that focuses on the economic challenges, on the humanitarian, on the social, on the environmental, as well as the security. Unlike many other countries, the secondary effects of the COVID crisis are most important. And it's not only about health right now, it's about all of these other multi-layered aspects that I just mentioned. Let's go to the next slide, please. A few weeks ago, we launched a report from our colleague, Greg, that gives us a survey of what we see happening in the response on the ground. So I invite all of you to take a look at that paper, that brief, just to summarize, to say fragile context countries are some of the most challenging countries right now on the SDG reversal and on the prospects for recovery over the long term. So now I would like to turn to fragile finances, to the debt issue, if I could. A couple of weeks ago, we launched a report with colleagues at UNDP that zoom in using World Bank data for 120 developing countries. We zoom in on 72 countries that have reached solvency liquidity ratios, or their deltas have changed, the rate of change of debt service in those countries or debt stock in those countries. And what we find is that of those 72, 19 are severely constrained right now and set up a pipeline, if you will, of debt crisis. If we talk about fragile and crisis context countries, we find that there are 39 of those 72 that I mentioned are in that category. So 19 of them are low-income countries, and 20 are middle-income countries. 87% of fragile context countries are highly debt vulnerable in our data set, in our analysis. Over to the next slide, please. What we find is that when you look at the 32, we see that 50% of debt vulnerable fragile countries have breached their solvency thresholds, and the severity of the breach is much higher for fragile context countries than the median developing country, by as much as 39 percentage points compared to 20 percentage points for other non-fragile context countries. And to the last slide on debt. As was mentioned earlier, an issue of concern is that the differences in fiscal support are stark, and we've seen this play out around the world for low-income and middle-income countries. But there is a specific concern for fragile contexts. We know that the average country has spent around 2.8% of GDP or invested during the response, which is far too low and too small a proportion to meet the challenges that they've been facing over the past 12 months. Additionally, 6 of 32 of these countries are not eligible for debt relief under the DSSI or the Common Framework. And this is something that we've been talking about with our colleagues from around the multilateral system. I think we have a common diagnostic about this, in that what is it that is slowing the rate of take-up on the DSSI? 43 countries of the 72 eligible have taken it up. 3 countries have taken up the Common Framework. This is not to play down on the DSSI and the Common Framework, but actually to ask what is constraining the rate of take-up. One of the issues has to do with private creditors and the role that private creditors play. Those are the non-Paris group players that we all know of. And the question is, what are the incentives that will bring them to the table? The second issue is the moral hazard issue, is the fact that countries that come to the table may face stigma just by joining conversations on debt restructuring or on debt moratoria. And we've seen that play out with credit ratings being downgraded because of interactions with the multilateral system. And finally, the question of whether the architecture is ready to supply the liquidity and also the fiscal resources that are needed. A very good news coming from the past few weeks has been the SDR allocation that will be happening sometime in August of this year. That will create a burst of liquidity to many countries and is of great significance for many middle-income countries. We need to still take a closer look at how this plays out for fragile context countries. Let me end with a final slide and with a call to action, which is to think about this question. Fragile countries are a test case for our multilateral system. They are undergoing a historic COVID reversal, facing enormous debt and fiscal space constraints. And we know that risk is a metric that punishes crisis and post-crisis countries. High risk means credit downgrades. High risk means higher yields on bonds if you can float bonds, in less access to the architecture of international debt and development. So we need to provide a floor on risk with state contingent instruments, with debt buybacks, with Brady bond type guarantees if needed, for those countries that are ensnared in a high risk feedback loop. More of the same clearly will not do. We think that, again, if some middle income countries and some SIDS are falling through the cracks of the international debt system, we better make sure that the fragile countries, that the crisis and post-crisis countries don't join that group, because the effects that we've seen over the past few months have been the historic COVID reversal has been very punishing in this environment. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, George Gray Molina, UNDP's chief economist. Much to mull over there. We'll come back to you, actually. I've got dozens of questions for you, but I see a few are coming in now. Now, Sudan has been going through a tremendous transition since the civil uprising saw the army topple the Bashir regime in 2019. His Excellency Nur el-Din Sati is the current Sudanese ambassador to the United States of America. He's the first ambassador to Washington from Khartoum in 20 years. Your Excellency, you're very welcome. Now, Sudan has a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to recover and revive its battered economy. It's a fragile transition, I think you would agree, fragile transition to democracy. So how can Sudan be best supported through this crisis as it seeks to build forward better? You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mark. Let me start by saying how thankful I am to UNDP, OECD, and USIP for the invitation to participate in this important panel discussion on fragile finances, managing risk, supporting stability. Yes, how can Sudan be assisted? Actually, we know that Sudan has been suffering from a state of systemic fragility for many decades now, probably since independence of Sudan. The core of this fragility is the mismanagement and inequitable sharing of resources. As you rightly said, Mark, we now have a once in a generation or once in a lifetime opportunity as what is called the Sudanese model endeavors to achieve stability by reconciling the otherwise competing social, political, and military interests. This historical compromise has thus far preserved Sudan from being the worst-case scenario, which could have resulted in considerable destruction and probably open or reopening the conflict that existed between center and peripheries and within them. The Women and Youth Revolution of 2018-2019 has its agenda achieving civilian democratic rule, achieving peace, stability, and equitable development in the areas that had been fighting the central government for many decades, rebuilding the governance structure of the state, rebuilding the ailing economy, and reforming the fractured financial and economic system, organizing fair and transparent elections at the end of the 3 to 4 year transitional period. High on the agenda and indispensable for achieving these ambitious goals is the normalization of relations with regional and international bilateral and multilateral partners. And here I respond to your question about how Sudan can be assisted. Garnering support from regional and international partners is an essential requirement for fragile states emerging from crisis and are unable to stand on their own feet. At the same time, those states and their partners should avoid creating a situation of dependency that could be crippling to them, making them survive on continuous life support. Thus, the first lesson is that of helping countries to help themselves, but at the same time requiring countries to create situations whereby they can be supported and that whatever support is provided to them can be used with integrity, transparency, accountability, and efficacy. Support has been forthcoming thus far in a structured manner to Sudan from international partners, and we are charting together a model for supporting a country that returns from a compound and multifaceted crisis, a political, social, moral, and economic one. A set of measures and mechanisms have been put in place to support Sudan. Removing Sudan from the list of countries supporting or harboring terrorism was a game changer and was an essential step in rehabilitating and bringing in Sudan out of the cold. Removing obstacles for trade and commerce transaction within the international financial and banking system was one of the goals. Another one was eligibility for HIPIC, which is an ongoing process, and clearing the way for investments from the private sector and a facility from the US Exim Bank. Providing financial and technical support to the family support program, and which is very important in a context of poverty, support to the peace process and to the DDR-SSR processes, dealing with the crimes of the past through a transitional justice system that deals with impunity while allowing the country to move forward, and rebuilding the state's structure on the basis of accountability, transparency, and efficiency. Reform of the security structure and rebuilding it on the basis of respect for the basic rights of all citizens and putting it under civilian authority, undertaking deep legal and judiciary reforms, and of course, the issue of capacity has been mentioned, rebuilding the civil service and enhancing its capacity, and this is key. Supporting youth employment programs that can help draw upon the talent and creativity of the young Sudanese women and men who played a major part in the transformation which is taking place in Sudan. One of the issues that pose a real challenge to the situation in Sudan in many other situations is that of building a consensus on the agenda for change. Political, ideological, and regional considerations and competing interests weigh in heavily to add the various levels of complexity to the ongoing transformation process. In the case of Sudan, we have seen 4 or 5 major challenges. Civil-military relations have been and continue to be a highly controversial issue within the society and among the political and social elite. The tug of war over economic reform, which manifests itself in the controversy that oppose 2 schools of thought, a liberal one and a radical one, causing considerable harm to the economic situation. The secularity of the state, the issue of the identity of the state and the relation between religion and the state, also linked to religious freedoms, has been with us since independence. Courageous decisions are being taken to address this problem. The center and the periphery, the marginalization of various areas of Sudan, particularly in the Blue Nile state, Kordofan and Darfur, was at the origin of the wars that erupted in these areas since the 80s of last century. Now we are building what I call a web-based structure for support with the international community, and we are aware that Sudan's pathway from fragility to normalcy will be a tortuous one. The major challenge facing it is reconciling the many competing agendas, as I said. The international community has started the process to assist Sudan to come out of its present predicament and help it stand on its own feet. The Sudan's partners process is a good model for supporting stability in a country like Sudan. It has the merit of bringing around the table all bilateral and multilateral partners of Sudan. This is helpful to the extent that it can minimize competition, channel support in the right direction, and bring all whatever their ideological or political differences or competing interests to push in the same direction and help Sudan build a robust and cohesive foundation for its political and socio-economic transformation. The forthcoming Paris conference is one more landmark event in the valuable support provided to Sudan and the international community to emerge from its current state of fragility. The international community has recently recognized the need for a different model for dealing with fragile states through a framework which requires partnership, recognition of the causes of fragility in a particular context, and the importance of resolving issues that have caused conflict and violence in fragile states. This can be seen not only in the different methodologies for assessment of post-conflict needs, but also in the approach of institutions like the World Bank, IMF, the African Development Bank towards fragile states. Sudan has, over the last 12 months, benefited immensely from the fragile states approach taken by the major development partners, helping Sudan get off the SSTL and improving relations with the World Bank, IMF, and FAFD will soon lead to unlocking financial resources from these institutions, which could easily average between $1 to $1.5 billion a year for the next 3 years. Attention needs to be given to both the government of Sudan's capacity to manage these resources and the international partners' capacity to program and manage the implementation of programs and projects emanating from these funds. Compounding all of this has been the impact of COVID-19, which has been mentioned by previous speakers over the last 12 to 14 months. The fragility of the health system and its near collapse has been brought home. Similarly, recent events in Darfur show the fragility of the peace in that region. The government has taken measures to protect civilians and combat insecurity in Darfur. Achieving the goals of peace, justice, and freedom will not be easy, but at least we shall endeavor, with the assistance of our development partners, to lay a solid and sustainable foundation for their achievement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nureldin Sati, Ambassador of Sudan to the United States. There, we'll come back to you with a few questions about some of the things that you've mentioned. Now, on to Somalia and Denmark. The developmental relationship between these two countries, Denmark and Somalia, dates back to the year 1980. And since 2011, Denmark has focused its support to Somalia on security, diplomacy, governance, improving jobs and living standards. In July last year, Denmark joined the Netherlands and the UK in committing to fund critical infrastructure in Somaliland. The investment will provide clean water, better roads and better farmlands. Jens Petter Derbach, he's the Chief Technical Advisor on Governance and Development Finance at the Danish Embassy for Somalia. He has a huge amount of experience working on stabilization in crisis context across Africa. Jens Petter worked for several development agencies such as UK DFID before he took his current role with his fellow Danes. Well, his LinkedIn page says his USP is to be brutally honest, give brutally honest analysis followed by best actions and options. That's exactly what I'm going to ask you, Jens. Could you speak for 7 minutes, please, on the Danish approach to supporting stability in countries like Somalia through such an unusual crisis like this?
Thanks, Mark. Yes, I shall do my best. I just want to stress one or two points. First, I am an advisor, which means technically I don't represent Danish views. What I'm telling you has been cleared by my core foreign affairs bosses, but also with a bit of freedom to be a little bit more provocative. So A, don't quote me as the Danish government, but B, also please be patient if you think I'm provoking you too much. I will give or share some experiences and foundations for what we have done as Denmark. But actually before that, I just want to share one bigger policy point, which is partly my own experience, but also very much a shared Danish experience that we discuss a lot internally. And that is, I think during the last decade or longer or shorter for some, we've come a very, very long way in the terms of the policy frameworks around fragility. I commented eagerly on Frank and the World Bank's development of their fragile strategy, pushed it very hard when they didn't always use do no harm as often as I would like. But I think we are in a very good place collectively in that area. Yet, we think there are two very important other challenges, or related, you may call them downstream challenges. First, and this is in some ways a bit surprising, I think, being much more aware of the political economy around implications of aid. That especially goes in super fragile environments such as Somalia, where we de facto as the international community, and we see that very, very clearly now as there's a massive crisis even by Somalia standards, around legitimacy of the president, and, well, I hardly dare say it, risks of collapse to 1991 collapse. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's tense. And yet we have, I think, arguably oftentimes been quite, I promise not to use the word naive, so I won't, but kind of very technical in our approach, instead of kind of looking to what Alex de Waal and others have talked about around the political marketplace. So that's definitely one area. I might say it's often unpopular at country level to raise this, and yet I could ask myself what happened to INCAF's 10 principles of aid or not doing harm from more than a decade ago, if I remember. And frankly, it links directly to efficiency of aid and ultimately our joint objective of reducing poverty. The second one is a little bit more complicated, but equally important. That's the quality of staff. When you work in a fragile state, very junior people often meet much, much more senior people than they would in another place. I've worked in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. I've been a presidential advisor. You know, it would be very difficult to meet the president or senior minister there unless you were at Frank's level or head of a big development agency or an embassy. In Somalia, a third secretary may meet a minister. That's sometimes a good thing, but it also comes at a price. Mind you, fragile states are not always the most popular postings. They're not family posts most of the time. So, and yet they are the ones that need the most professional people and the best qualified people, because unlike Kenya or Ghana or Uganda, they don't have a strong civil service, as other speakers have already talked about. So I just wanted to raise that. I think, and this is maybe the provocative part, so please don't take offense, anyone. Too often I see these two dimensions, or lack of respect of those, to what I could call, or Francis Fukuyama calls, isomorphic mimicry. We build institutions, we do debt relief, we build PFM systems, we build public sectors, but they're shells because we don't get the politics right. And we also tend to be tactical in that regard, so we can sell results that fits with our posting periods or terms. That leads to very high risks of doing harm, both short-term and medium-term. So yeah, provocation over. Let me move to our portfolio and some of our lessons. Denmark, we see ourselves as a small country, obviously, because we are. We have a medium-sized aid budget, as in terms of global levels. And right now, in terms of our Somalia program, a relatively big countries program. That was deliberate. If we are to be serious, we need to have the staff that can actually implement both the program, but also do the political dialogue around it. So yeah, that was a really, really important part, getting the analysis right. I think one of the things that attracted me, since you mentioned it, Mark, to move from a fantastic job in DFID or the FCO to my native Denmark was that we exactly connected the technical and the political. It was very strongly based on analysis, really exciting program with very clear objectives to be in it for the long term, as you mentioned, but also to address the root causes. This is not just to do some front-end stabilization or to build some peace dividend things, or to build a road, but actually, how do we help Somalia come to peace with itself, and how can we address the real root causes that causes so much harm to poor Somalis and frankly, a terrorist risk to the region. So strong focus. By most standards, it's actually at the bottom of the fragility, of any fragility index you can find. So yeah, that was the background. If you look at the portfolio superficially, it actually looks pretty standard. There's one pillar on kind of the settlement, one on economic development, and one on durable solutions stroke humanitarian. So that's not where we are unusual in any way, I think. What we do have, and that's where it gets a little bit more unusual, I think, and it was designed by Nina, who should have spoken instead of me, so she could have given a much better background to that. But really, we have a backbone of relatively safe, all multi-donor funded programs. So we are typically more active than our Scandinavian partners in those, but that's basically the core of the portfolio. However, it's not necessarily where we spend most of our time. We have a number of much smaller strategic partnerships, either directly, let's say, with think to that. Or am I back online? Sorry. I'll continue talking unless I'm told I'm offline. So yeah, we have some really interesting partnerships deliberately. One, for instance, between the UK, the US, and Denmark, where we're obviously the smaller but more active partner to really help on the political parts. I will keep coming back to the politics because I think that's where we are different, and I think that's where we try to add value, connecting the technical and the political. We have a very strong internal foundation that the political settlement is crucial. We can work as much as we do with IFC or on the IMF with debt relief. If we don't push on the settlement, we will not make genuine progress. Our sales point, in a way, is we're small enough to still be much more nimble, and that means we can connect. I can go straight to my ambassador or straight to our Brussels people with whatever point. So oftentimes we would have been the first mover in that kind of on whatever issues it would happen to be. I'll finish off with two points. One on the biggest surprises, stroke challenges, and the second one in around that we can make a difference. One, and I've hinted it before, in Somalia, and others have talked about numbers before. Aid is $2 billion. GDP is 5 billion if you ask the IMF, and it's 6 billion if you ask the banks. So somewhere between 33 and 40% of the total GDP, not of the budget. It's 1,100 times local revenue. local revenue is around $200 million. I think forum, it sounds like as if we're sitting lost again. Mark?
Yeah, no, we've got you back there again. So go ahead, Jens.
Okay, I'm just finishing. So I think really speaking with confidence, use the analysis we have, use the weight we have, use the fact that we're aligned in terms of our objectives, but then also take responsibility for these objectives and accept that, you know, to help a place like Somalia and other super fragile states, we need to take responsibility. We are often seen as that umpire, and that comes with responsibility. It's not like doing some contributing to a road project in Kenya where it would probably build anyway. So in short, really, we have the policies, we have the objectives, we have the analysis, we have the technical capacity, but for real stability and results, we need to accept the politics, and then we need to collaborate and then take responsibility. Let me stop there. I hope I didn't provoke anyone too badly. Forward to the questions and discussion. Thanks a lot.
No, thank you, Jens Petter Dobak, the Chief Technical Advisor, Denmark there. You promised brutally honest analysis followed by best actions and options, and you gave us just that. I see lots of questions coming in. So if we may, let's turn, we've got about 15 minutes or so that we can take some of the questions. Frank, if you're still there, Frank Bousquet, Deputy Director of IMF, I'd like to go to you first to pose some questions to you. I think you stirred quite a lot of interest with your presentation there. Here's a double-edged question, and this could be sort of like the elephant in the room, so best to sort of approach it first. Frank, the IMF is traditionally the lender of last resort, but I guess for most countries in fragile context, COVID means we've reached the last resort. So the question is a simple one. Is the IMF doing enough? Why has it not lent more out of its, say, $1 trillion lending capacity? It's used less than 5% of that during the COVID crisis. I think about $43 billion to 78 countries in 2020. There's about 90% still in the bag, unused. And countries, as you say, as you admitted in your presentation, are struggling to finance their pandemic response. It's a double-edged question, because I also want to ask you also in your answer to answer this. You mentioned that last year the IMF and the World Bank launched the DSSI, this debt service suspension initiative, and the accompanying framework to help low-income borrowers. But as I think it was George that mentioned, that many governments appear very hesitant to tap into it for various reasons, but it seems to be one of the main reasons is the fear of triggering a default in the eyes of credit rating agencies that are watching them very closely, which would then make it more difficult for them to borrow money in the future. How do you fix that conundrum? So go ahead, Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, much appreciated. Just a quick point. So I think the fund has really scaled up massively in terms of the response for those countries. Obviously, no single organization can take it alone, and that was a key point. There is a need for more concessional financing, for more grants, and every actor has a key role to play. When I was just mentioning that we had actually, since start of COVID-19, more than 26 fragile states that have received emergency financing or disbursement, which about $5.9 billion. In addition, it's not only a question of providing financing, it's about what has been the role played in terms of benefiting from debt service relief, which is also extremely important. As I said again, 21 fragile states have benefited from it. Last but not least is the whole point about playing a key role with the bank under the G20 DSSI framework to really help. And today we have about, I believe, 43 out of 73 eligible countries that have benefited from the DSSI in terms of debt service suspension, which is extremely important as well. So I think, it's not only a question about financing by one institution. You have to look at the global picture. significantly, we don't have the graph anymore, but significantly increased compared to what it was before. But we have also to realize that it's a deeper issue. It's also looking beyond just the emergency financing or looking at the debt. And the debt, as I mentioned before, it's looking at it in different way. The DSSI, but also the common framework for debt treatment beyond the DSSI, where the fund is playing a very important role. And also I was looking at some questions about debt transparency, another area where the fund and the bank are playing a key role, which is to help for debtors and creditors to have a better understanding of the debt vulnerabilities of different countries. If you don't have that, very difficult. So the bank, World Bank, but also the fund are really moving forward on the whole capacity development for debt monitoring. So again, there's a question of looking how much has been done compared to previous years, significantly scale up, but also looking at all the other work that looked around the debt issue, debt transparency, common framework for debt treatments, which goes well beyond one organization, and of course the DSSI. And I think it's important to capture. Obviously, more needs to be done by the international community when you look at the debt vulnerabilities that I mentioned, and that requires stepping up in terms of ODA, concessional financing, and grant at the end of the day, in addition to all the different reforms that will be able to take place. There was also questions from Rachel Scott, by the way, I saw it on the chat regarding how do you take into account security expenditures and so on. I think it was a very important point to recognize, again, why partnership with other organizations is important. You have some organizations that are really looking at public financial management of these sectors that allows other actors to better understand the efficiency that are possible, but also how to ensure that some critical spending in key sectors, health, education, are preserved. So I think, incorporating key drivers of fragility in those countries, that's also recognizing that spending in the security sectors has increased, that it's important for those countries that are dealing with a lot of non-state actors. And that's why leveraging diagnostic of other organizations in these sectors allows the fund and other partners to get a better diagnostic and know what needs to be done in this context. So that's really an important point from Rachel. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Frank. Just before I go on to I see that this question keeps coming in. I just want to know, you're hearing it over there, the IMF, and you're acknowledging it and you're answering the question, but this question keeps coming. Could you move faster? I see it here, actually, a question from Cedric Skurik from the FCDO that says, are IFIs and donors moving fast enough on debt relief to minimize the risk of increased instability? Could you move faster? Are you saying that this discussion is being had at the IMF and that you're acknowledging that you need to move faster, or you could move faster, or you are going to move faster? I just want you to clear that up.
Listen, COVID-19 is a major crisis, as once in a century. And I do believe that the efforts from the international community, from the fund and many partners have been significant. As I said, it's not only a question about providing more emergency financing. This has been the case, but it's also looking at what are some of the key issues, such as debt vulnerabilities, and how we can help the international community move on this regard. So, it's not only looking at the number of countries that are benefiting from emergency financing, as I mentioned, significantly scaled up, more than $5.9 billion, but it's also about looking at the debt vulnerabilities and helping in the context of the G20 framework to move on this agenda, which has huge leveraging factor. So I do believe that the response has been massive. Obviously, a lot remains to be done. Let's not forget that we are dealing with a major pandemic crisis.
Okay, thank you, Frank. I'll now move on to Ambassador Nour-el-Din Sati. Ambassador, in December last year, Sudan was taken off the state sponsors of terror list by Washington. It was on it for 27 years. So this officially ends years of crippling sanctions, and it really allows Sudan to get the vital economic support that it really needs. So IMF, for one, and other institutions can now offer Sudan loans and debt relief. First, my question is, can you tell us the significance of getting off that list and how re-engagement can help Sudan as an economy stand, as it stands, possibly on the edge of freefall? And also, are you satisfied with the current levels of support that you're getting from the international community? I know that 40 countries, I think on May 17th, are going to be going to France. 40 countries will join the host, France, at Sudan Partnership Conference. The conference, you're going to be discussing easing foreign debt. You're going to be discussing how to invest in Sudan. What are your expectations for the conference?
Thank you very much, Frank. Yes, removing Sudan from the terror list is significant in the sense you can just imagine that Sudan for the last 27 years has been operating outside the international monetary system and going through all kinds of stratagems in order to find a way of dealing with the regional and international partners. Removing Sudan from the list actually is a game changer in the sense that it allows Sudan to come back to the monetary system and to relearn, I think, ways of doing things in a proper manner and be looked at as a trustful and respectable partner. So it removes all the hurdles that prevented Sudan from dealing normally with the international community and rehabilitating, which is very important also, the image of Sudan and the Sudanese who had suffered a stigma for so long. So this normalization is key in order to allow Sudan to benefit from international support, from investments and dealing normally with the international banking system and to receive flows and support, financial and technical, humanitarian support from the outside world. The second question, whether I'm satisfied, of course I am. Of course I am. The solidarity that the international community has shown to Sudan throughout the last 2 years, I think is overwhelming. And we are thankful to all our partners who have come to the rescue of Sudan and who have organized themselves in Friends of Sudan, Partners of Sudan, and who are prepared to do whatever it takes to help Sudan succeed its civil and democratic transition, which is in the way of being done. The Paris conference is, and here, let me also say that I'm thankful to USIP, our co-host here. I just signed a memo of understanding with my good friend Lisa Grande, and these are the other aspects of assistance which are not financial but go deep into the society, the social structure, and help the society recover from its many ailings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Let me move on to a question. Maybe our chief economist at UNDP wants to tackle this. If anybody else has an opinion, please step in. This is an open forum. This question is coming from the YouTube, people watching on YouTube. It says, what kinds of things can we do to support countries' tax revenues in fragile contexts? This must be very tough and populations are often extremely poor. Maybe you want to tackle that, George.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think an important point that was made by Jens was that a lot of the development issues are actually political economy, institutional and political issues at heart that involve trust, that involve a virtuous cycle of starting to link taxation policy with provision of services. And we've seen this happen throughout the developing world over the past 20 or 30 years, that the way to get it moving is to create that virtuous cycle. Now, having said that, that's easier said than done. We know that precisely the issue here is how to create stable politics, how to create the level playing field, how to get that loop in place in which you have capabilities, institutional capacity, and also the political trust to be able to build a broad-based tax system. Many of the issues that are common to developing countries right now and that affect fragile countries in particular are what type of taxes can take hold. So we usually start with natural resource rents and so on, move to value-added and indirect taxes. But we know that eventually we want to get to the full array of natural resource, indirect, but direct taxes as well. And that, again, is a long-term process. So I believe that's part of the political economy of development in fragile contexts.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on this issue of raising taxes at such a time? Perhaps Frank.
No, I mean, there are a few points. I think taking into account the fact that obviously tax revenue is the best way to move in terms of raising financing, but at the same time recognizing that the gradual approach, as I mentioned, is essential. So, looking first, I would say, on the revenue collections, trying to look at more, easy to collect tax, can have, for instance, custom duties at the border, but also trying to progressively look at not necessarily what would be ideal, but what can be done in the short term. So the whole point is about exactly what Rachel Scott mentioned in the chat, is how do you approach this issue of fiscal reform in fragile states in a different way than in non-fragile states? And the response is to say it's long-term engagement. It's not making necessarily the decision that you will take in another ideal situation, but more looking at what is easy to done, what are some of the quick wins, and what are the impact as well in terms of addressing some key drivers of fragility. There is a number of studies that have been done looking at some on the expenditure side as well, on what are some of the top priorities in terms of controlling the budget, looking as well at introducing basic payment systems, control of budget executions. So going for the basics, making sure that we fully analyze the political economy and the dimensions and also the consequence of some of those increases, and therefore phase the approach over time. So that's the whole point about incorporating drivers of fragility in this context, like was mentioned just before.
Merci, Frank. Jens Petter, you made some very interesting and provocative comments on sort of not getting the politics right, really sort of a deep dive and deep thinking, bold thinking on the very nature of the architecture around aid and debt relief and the whole setup. It sounds like you would like to see some sort of radical change, a quick change, connecting the technical and the political and addressing the root causes. It made me think about this idea of kind of like having the confidence to not go project to project, but really sort of engage in a closer partnership with countries to really get to the root causes of problems and help them with it. Can you just kind of give us a little bit more meat on the bone, what you were talking about there?
I can, and some of it almost relates to the tax logic. If you see tax as the binding or the glue between the population or the rulers and the ruled. But what I mean, it's not that I'm calling for revolution. It's more that, from my perspective, I think we can actually do so much more in terms of impact, which I assume is what the taxpayers in the aid-giving countries, if you want to use that term, want, and certainly the political or policy objectives are for all of us. They certainly are for Denmark. So I see it as a win-win. I do think there's some, at times, radical change needed, but not necessarily in what we do, but rather how we do it. So I think there's a big
Oh, I think we've lost him again. He's been having some problems.
in Somalia on aid architecture. I'm back. Yeah, I sit in the bush in Zambia right now, so I'm sorry.
We lost the last 20 seconds, so if you could rewind 20 seconds.
Okay, yeah. No, I'm just saying, I'm not calling for a revolution, but I do think we can actually achieve results, not necessarily on changing so much what we do, but how we do it. And as I said, that's using the tools we have, but maybe accept that. Well, I do think there's a very important point in binding the technical with the political, and that's, as I started out saying, definitely goes with tax, in a Somali context, but it was the same when I worked in the Niger Delta or in northeastern Nigeria. It's not that people don't pay tax, it's just that they pay to one of the, or more of the 230 militias that are in Somalia. No container goes through the port of Mogadishu without paying 2 or 3 types of taxes to Al-Shabaab before you start paying taxes to the Somali government. So that I really buy into what Frank and I think also others said around the gradual approach, but it has to be inherently political. Otherwise, you just overtax really poor people and you're not using it to build the legitimacy. But answering your question, I think get the politics and the technical together is absolutely crucial, especially in places where we are really big players. We need to take that responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I have time for one last question. George, could you close us out on the Q&A? Now, if we look at countries like Afghanistan, we see that things like capacity building of government, I'm thinking about working within the government, has been a really difficult task. Policy reforms been sometimes fragmented, sometimes disjointed, sometimes uncoordinated. So how much do you call for rethinking of the approach to managing change within fragile states and working with them to make that happen?
Thanks so much, Mark. I think what we start by doing is recognizing that governments and peoples are in the driving seat, and they are the ones that set the pace of how much change can be accomplished. And it usually starts with a commitment to peace, but then it bridges onto institutional building, onto political broad partnerships. And countries like Afghanistan that you mentioned, but many other countries are facing that bridge, the move from peace to development. And as we think about that process, it's, as many others have mentioned, not just a technical issue, it's a political issue, but it's something in which the driver seat is very important. All of us in the multilateral system, all of us in the bilateral system as well, can do only so much because the driver's seat is the people, is the legitimacy, is the government. And I think that's where we get started. We tailor our approaches to what's happening on the ground, and we build from there on. But I think that's the quid of the question in fragile context right now.
Thank you so much, George. I think that ends it now. I think we're out of time, but I want to thank some great panelists. There were great presentations to kick us off, and some very, very succinct and pertinent answers to sometimes tough questions to answer. So I appreciate your time. That was wonderful. We'll now move on to the closing statements, and we have two. First, Dr. Martin Schulz is with Germany's Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, commonly known as BMZ. He's the head of Division, Peace and Security, Disaster Risk Management. Martin wears two hats, actually. He's also co-chair of INCAF, the International Network on Conflict and Fragility. Dr. Schulz, sir, partnerships seem to be everything. That's something we've heard in the last 90 minutes. So tell us how we take things forward. Go ahead, you have the floor.
Yeah, oh, thank you, Mark, for these very kind words. And what should I say? A heartfelt thank you for, first of all, to all the speakers for a really fascinating discussion. I learned a lot. The risks are clear and far-reaching. What we heard is that less fiscal space to respond to crises reduces investment in the SDGs. It constrains economic opportunities for individuals and communities, and it may also increase the risks of conflict. But as always in life, there are also opportunities. In fragile states, as we have heard, ODA remains a significant resource, even in the face of fiscal pressure. If we look at 2019, 70% of the ODA that goes to developing countries compared with 25% of the remittances and just 5% of global FDI flows. And more institutions like those we have heard today and that joined us today, and this is good news really, are working hard to tailor their work to fragile contexts. We heard that reducing fragility is not just about spending more. It's about money. It's about resources and expertise spent well and wisely in ways that support resilience, stability, and expertise, and peace, rather than focusing on the dollar value alone. Given the fiscal and debt constraints, how do we prioritize and program now in fragile contexts, now and not later as we face another crisis, so that we reduce the potential for instability and conflict? And here, in my view, three main points jump out. A first point is financial resources and economic choices can have an impact on fragility and vice versa, including the macro fiscal environment. And what does that mean for our work at the global and country level? Let's think about how we bring a financing and economic perspective to key transition points, such as the withdrawal of peacekeepers, undertaking security sector reform, or the increasing tensions that we are sadly seeing in Somalia or Ethiopia. And George has made a reference to that in his intro. And let's think about how we use fragility analysis to inform key financing processes, such as the HIPIC that has been mentioned, or building macroeconomic systems to ensure they meet their traditional goals while also supporting stability and peace. Second, there has been a drive to look beyond ODA towards broadening the economic base, promoting diverse forms of financing, including countries' ability to raise and spend revenue and attract investment. And this is, in fact, a huge agenda, and we need to understand better how to tailor it and to integrate it into our work. And I would like to give you some examples. Develop and prioritize effective approaches to raising and managing public money that help to build the social contract as well as generate revenue. Well, this requires political commitment, first of all, which can be difficult at times and slow also, but there are opportunities to innovate, to partner, and to work at the local level. Investment to very fragile states remains very low. We know that. We want to promote direct foreign investment, DFI, but not for its own sake, but to build stability and to promote peace, better developing local and regional markets from what is often at what we say a very low level. We need to learn how to tailor approaches to fragile context. And the third point, the crisis has shown the low resilience of fragile states, and with ODA budgets under pressure and the financial landscape increasingly stressed, it is more important than ever that ODA is spent better to build stability, resilience, and peace. Building forward better in a way in fragile contexts requires looking at the drivers of fragility, and Frank made a reference to that, and focusing on our collective efforts on preventing crisis and stability rather than simply responding to crises only when they are out of control. Let me give you some examples. Given the fiscal squeeze, what do we prioritize to, in a way, minimize instability? One obvious candidate is the social safety nets, but there are other socioeconomic interventions that play an important role. And if I remember correctly, it was George from UNDP. You made a reference to many other examples. Another key area is building capacities around development, finance, expertise on the ground. And I think, Frank, it was you made a strong reference to the issue of capacity building, which is absolutely right. As we see, colleagues, there is a lot to be done, and we don't know all the answers yet. In fragile context, it is a matter of trying and learning and sometimes sadly failing, but learning and getting up again and trying again. The INCAF network, and Frank, you were kind enough to say that, I have the privilege to co-chair with my UK colleagues. It brings together fragility experts from most of the world's major donors, alongside experts from the IMF, development banks, and UN agencies. And we are certainly committed to generating knowledge, engaging more effectively, and increasing the quality of policy as it impacts on fragile contexts. How we respond to COVID-19 and the issues it has exacerbated, its economic, political, social, security, and environmental fragility, alongside the erosion of human capital, will be a key challenge over the coming months and years. And to respond effectively, we want to promote a solid partnership between fragility experts on the one hand and their financing experts colleagues on the other hand, sharing knowledge and experience through our work, contributing to yours and sharpening our strategies as well. Fragility has many different dimensions, and initiatives that span or merge disciplines are needed to better understand and address these challenges and impacts of engaging in fragile contexts. So the challenges are high, but the readiness and the willingness I felt today is also high. So, well, my final words is just to thank you for joining us today, and we certainly do look forward to working with you to take this work forward. And with these final words, Mark, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. Martin Schulz there of BMZ, and he's co-chair of INCAF as well, talking about how we take it forward and the importance of partnerships between the financing and fragility communities. Well, this certainly is a moment of risk, as we've heard, but it's also a significant opportunity to recalibrate the financing of fragility contexts. And for the final word, I turn to Lisa Grande. Ms. Grande has served as the president of the United States Institute of Peace, or USIP, which is one of our partners for this development dialogue episode. She's been there, she just arrived really, since December 1st, 2020. She's previously served in several positions at the United Nations as well. You're very welcome to have the last word, Lisa, on this development dialogue. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark. On behalf of the U.S. Institute for Peace, we'd like to extend a very big thank you to our friends and partners at the OECD and UNDP for co-organizing this event, and to all of our speakers and panelists for your wisdom and thought-provoking reflections. Several points have jumped out of today's discussion. The impact of COVID on the global economy, and very particularly on countries that were already in trouble or transition before the pandemic. What's also jumped out are the impressive steps that are being taken to address the impact of COVID through proactive, flexible financing by international financial institutions and donors. And what's also jumped out is the fact that there are many things that we still can and should be doing to help support countries that are in trouble, to help rescue them now. One of the points that came through very strongly today is just how staggering the impact of the pandemic really is. The world economy has been unbalanced and wildly unequal for a long time. We all know this. But COVID is making income, productivity, and development gaps so deep, we have to face the fact that we may not be able to reduce or bridge them for generations to come. Countries which were struggling and fragile before COVID are now very fragile, and in some cases, catastrophically so. Hunger is rising, jobs are lost across nearly every sector, and human indicators are likely to plummet. Many countries which were okay and on the right path before COVID, including countries in transition, are now facing bewildering, deeply complex health, social, economic, and political upheavals. Difficult reforms are being sidetracked, and the gains these countries have made in productivity, prosperity, and human development are eroding. In many ways, these countries are becoming fragile in real time, right in front of our eyes. The picture, of course, for developed nations is very different. The world's richest countries are finding ways to finance their recovery, pay for vaccines and public health, and rapidly make up for lost growth with Keynesian stimulus packages, which are being used to transform outmoded infrastructure, generate jobs, and expand market share in high-value sectors. Because the implications of deepening fractures in the international global economy are so significant and pressing for our shared prosperity and our shared security, the challenge in front of us is clear. We've got to double down and find ways as quickly and as responsibly as possible to extend financing to the countries which need it the most. As we collectively roll up our sleeves to do this, our panelists today have pointed to two key requirements. First, all of us know that the institutions and donors providing financing need to do so in ways which avoid creating generational burdens that cannot be reasonably met or managed by the fragile and transitional country receiving the financing. If this isn't done, the countries which are already at the bottom will sink deeper and will be at the bottom far longer than we all hope. Second, all of us also know that it's time for the institutions and donors providing financing to adopt intelligence-sensitive but forward-leaning systems for managing the risks that they are facing when they loan, relieve, write off, or grant funding. We need a new generation of responsible mechanisms that allow us to know and wait and mitigate and manage the risks that we're facing in highly volatile, transitional, very fragile countries. Some impressive things are being done. The decision of the IMF to expand allocation of special drawing rights and the steps being taken by the G20 to move from debt suspension to debt relief by the end of this year are huge. It's been great today to reflect on what more needs to and can be done and to see a consensus emerging on a number of key elements. These include, first, the need to ensure that financing of priorities to address the country's most pressing needs have to be defined by the people in these countries through transparent, inclusive mechanisms, whether these needs are infrastructure, job creation, public health, agricultural support, or education. This is a point that was made very compellingly by my good friend, Ambassador Sati. Second, we need to be smarter about using international financing to mobilize domestic financing and to also accelerate reforms in public administration and public financial management. We've talked about this for years, and we've done some very creative things across the globe. But given the scope of the crisis we are together facing, we probably need to keep thinking of new ways of doing this, even in the most fragile contexts. These are key points that both Frank and George shared with us today. Third, many of us are renewing our commitment to advance transparency about sovereign debt. And those of us who aren't doing this yet need to jump on board. This is a point that Jens Petter has made, and again, made it compellingly. People everywhere need to know what their leaders are doing with their country's wealth and the debts they are incurring, which future generations will have to pay. One of the best ways to do this is to provide more resources in the countries receiving financing for parliamentary oversight, for independent media, and for building the capacity of governments to report, regulate, and to be held accountable. It's also time for the international community to agree on transparency norms for sovereign and commercial lenders. We need to hold the light up. If an institution or government is lending money to countries in trouble, they have a responsibility to be frank and honest about the terms and conditions under which they are doing so. A final point about the United States. The US's Global Fragility Act creates a new framework that opens new possibilities to finance national priorities using national institutions in countries that need help, and to manage the risks of doing this in collaboration with our counterparts and our partners. The Global Fragility Act gives the US the tools to be part of a global solution to a global problem. Many of us are committed to making this happen. Mark, thanks so much for facilitating and monitoring this session, and thanks to all of our participants and sponsors.
And thanks to you, Lisa Grande at USIP there. Excellent way to round this up. Very, very excellent. And I want to thank all the great speakers today. I'll echo Lisa's and actually Martin's messages in saying that there's so much work that we must do together. I think, Lisa, you said we've got to double down and collectively roll up our sleeves, from your mouth to God's ears, I hope. I love these development dialogues because I learn a lot, and I'm sure you do too. We still, actually, by the way, have 2 months of UNDP dialogues. The next one is next week on May 5th. The theme is Transitional Justice for Peace and Development in conflict-affected regions. And it includes some great case studies from the Gambia, Guatemala, Colombia, and the Central African Republic. Please join us for that. Well, that's it from us. Thanks again to all our wonderful panelists and speakers. I'm Mark Edo, and it's been a pleasure to moderate today. Goodbye, and see you again soon.